Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Those of you who don't know me, my name is Ken, and it's your misfortune not having to be the chairman of Orwell AS. I'd like to welcome you all to this, which evening will probably be our main 40th anniversary celebration. I'd like to welcome guest members of neighbouring astronomical societies. There's at least one SHA person from East Anglia present. There are other guests as well, including two esteemed former presidents of the BAA, Martin Mobley and Tom Bowles. Martin's the chap who's currently cringing at the front. A couple of apologies to give you. David Payne. David was the chairman of this society for more than half of his existence. Can't be with us tonight because he's on business in the USA, but he sends you his best wishes. Andrew Oster, the school headmaster, would like to have been here, but unfortunately this clashes with his concert at the school. And Simon Pott, the man we deal with now on the school governors, he's on business in Bury St Edmunds, which isn't quite the same as USA. But, now, Orwell AS began in 1967. We don't know what date.
Yes, we do.
Do we?
Yes.
Brilliant, John. Come on.
It's not off the cup, but I've just given James all the stuff out, all the minutes, copies of the minutes of the Ipswich and District Natural History Society, from whom this society, the old society was born. Not this society, but the former one. Yes, beg your pardon. The date. This
We haven't got a date still.
Not for this one. No.
Oh, you're going there. Well, there we are, see, because I was about to say before that, from the very late 1940s, about 1948 to the mid-50s,
51. Yeah.
there was the Ipswich and District Astronomical Society. Now, they only used the observatories on certain days. They weren't based there as we are. And probably the reason for their demise, as much as anything, was the call to national service. It rather saw off all the young hot bloods in there. Before that, we had the Chaldean Society in the 20s and 30s, And a key member of that was a lady called Alice Grace Cook. She was also director of the BAA media section. Alice went on to help found IDAS as well, and she was still around until 1964, I believe she passed away. So she died just before Orwell came into existence. Now on my notes here we had a little prompt because Alan is usually late. Unfortunately he has to travel by the Late Western Railway, the London Underground, and OR. To you and I, that's the one and awful railway that happens to run up to Ipswich. And Peter Richards had offered to do some lap dancing in lieu of Alan being here. There's who I'm preaching now. Be careful what you've got of emails in the future. As to Alan himself, you know him, there's not much I can tell you. So I thought I'd try a little trawl on the internet to see if I could come up with some scoop. And I found one. And there is a CD on the market at the moment, Alan Chapman, All We Are. A powerful debut CD that uniquely fuses 70s guitar, rock and soul with a message of peace, love and harmony reflecting life in the 21st century. And it goes on to say, my name is Alan Chapman. I created this album pretty much all myself. Yeah, I still call them albums. I'm all about music. I grew up with mostly great guitar, rock and soul from the 70s. You know, Led Zeppelin, Neil Young, Humble Pie, Isley Brothers, Stevie Wonder. These bands, artists with a host of others always make their way into music. But that's not all I'm about. In my adoption of veganism and having an interest in our Earth Mother, then I realised that there is a lot of crap on the internet. So I don't want to stray into the usual hyperbole and repeat the many plaudits due to our honorary president, in fact the honorary president of a great many astronomical societies, and at least one national one. Let me just say that I want to give a great welcome to Professor Alan Chapman, who in his unique way is going to beguile us with tonight's very appropriate lecture. And the title is drawn straight from his groundbreaking book, The Victoria Amateur Astronomer, published in 1998 and about to be republished, Worth a Good Buy. Good plug here. How much do I get for that? Alan Chapman, That Clubbable Passion, the Amateur Astronomical Society.
As there's this magnificent pulpit, I really think I should use it. Well, thank you very much, Ken. I have no idea who my namesake might be. But let's put it this way, the only thing I know about a Led Zeppelin is that they can't fly. My knowledge of rock music is probably only rivaled by my knowledge of haute cuisine, which again is about as near to zero as possible, and my entire musical tradition came from the discovery of Johann Sebastian Bach at the age of 9. So I'm afraid that whoever this Alan Chapman is, has certainly no connection with me. It's an enormous pleasure to be your president, and especially, of course, to speak to you again tonight as part of the 40th celebration of the Orwell Astronomical Society. What I want to do, though, because whenever I speak to you, I like to have, because of its obvious connection and my long-standing research interest into George Biddle Airy, I want to say a little bit about an Airy connection I've been looking at recently. And this is very, very apposite to the present time, because, of course, this is the year of the abolition, the 200th anniversary of the abolition of slavery, which I was involved with a conference in London last weekend. And this is, curious enough, my second time in the pulpit this week, as you might have thought I'd be here. I had, in fact, to take the Templeton trustees, I gave them a lecture on abolition last Sunday, and we visited the church of John Newton, the great hymnalist and abolitionist, and I addressed them from his pulpit in St. Mary Woolnoth Church in the city of London, which was a tremendous honour and a delight. But what about Airy and the abolition of slavery? Well, you probably know of Thomas Clarkson. Clarkson, of course, was the great pioneer of the abolition movement. He was even actually active before William Wilberforce took the cause into Parliament. He became, first of all, fascinated by abolition and revolted by slavery when he won a prize essay at Cambridge in 1785. He later, at the end of what you might call his first political career, although he went back into the anti-slavery movement in the 1820s, he came to live in Playford, not very many miles away. He took the lease, the long lease, on Playford Hall, and 350 acres of prime farmland, and set up as a gentleman farmer. Now, who was also living in Playford but one Arthur Biddle? Arthur Biddle was also a gentleman farmer, agent, land valuer, collector of books, man of culture. Inevitably, the gentleman farmer and the retired abolitionist struck up a great friendship. Who was Arthur Biddle's extraordinarily precocious and bright nephew? The young George Airy, his sister's son. In fact, young George used to spend his summer vacations from grammar school at Playford. He came to meet Clarkson and tells us in his papers that are surviving, he first met Mr. Clarkson in about 1817, when Airy would have been about 16. And Mr. Clarkson encouraged me to go to Cambridge. Now, none of the Airys or the Biddles had ever been to university. But in fact, it was Mr. Clarkson who encouraged Airy to go to university. It was really in many ways, therefore, Clarkson who pushed him into what would become an extraordinary astronomical career. George Biddle Airy went on to Trinity College, Cambridge, in 1820. He actually became first wrangler, winning the highest mathematical prize in the university. He was elected a fellow of his college. He was elected to Newton's old professorship, the Lucasian chair, when he was a mere 24. And 2 years later, Plumian Professor of Astronomy, with control of the new University Observatory. And in 1835, he became Astronomer Royal. He had, of course, always a close connection with Ipswich. And, of course, his famous lectures in 1848, delivered to the Ipswich Society, the Mechanics Society, I understand were given only just across the road from here. Now, Clarkson died in 1846 at the age of 86. But Airy then, always being a man who never forgot a friend, never forgot someone who encouraged him, and never forgot someone to whom he was indebted, then starts a national campaign for a Clarkson Memorial. Because sadly, Clarkson, by the end of his life, had become rather eclipsed. William Wilberforce's two rather pushy sons had written a major biography of their father, which rather sidelined Clarkson. And as a result of this, whilst Wilberforce goes into Westminster Abbey, Clarkson is quietly forgotten. George Biddle Airy starts to raise money for a memorial to Clarkson. And of course the magnificent one erected in the late 1850s in Playford Churchyard, about 8 years after he died, after Clarkson died, became the first memorial. Rather curiously, it was not until the late 1980s that there was also a Clarkson Memorial in Westminster Abbey, very close to that of Wilberforce, his great friend. And although, of course, like I say, Wilberforce and Clarkson were great friends, sadly, Wilberforce's sons rather sidelined his memory. So therefore, I want to start off by saying that not only do I have another connection of George Biddle Airy to mention to you, but in this very, very appropriate year of the double anniversary of the banning of slavery and the banning of the slave trade, it was, in fact, George Biddle Airy who was the motivating force to the remembering of Thomas Clarkson. And of course, tomorrow we're going to go and see the Clarkson Memorial and, of course, the Clarkson grave at Playford Churchyard. So I thought, lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you. I thought I'd mention that as a way of starting. Thank you. But then to look more at the astronomical side. What was the nature of English astronomy in the 19th century? Because George Biddle Airy was an exceptional figure. He was exceptional insofar that he was totally, utterly and absolutely a professional. He fully admitted to the Lords Commissioners of Admiralty in 1835, when he was offered the post of Astronomer Royal, that he had no money, he hadn't inherited any money, and his wife had no money. As a result, therefore, he needed to be paid a proper salary, and he succeeded in making the government cough up a 25% increase on the salary of his previous incumbent, John Pond. This begins a lifetime of 46 years of dedication of Airy at the Royal Observatory. But Airy, as a professional, was a very unusual figure, because most people in 19th century British astronomy were what I would call amateurs, or grand amateurs. In fact, Airy even himself recognised the importance of this fact, because Airy pointed out that whilst as director of the Royal Observatory, he saw it as his job to provide the nation with key pieces of astronomical and physical data, such as the lunar orbit, the nature of the weather, the tides, things of this sort, the duty of the Astronomer Royal to be valuable first to the Navy, then to the Merchant Marine. On the other hand, he did not require that it was his job to conduct original research into unknown branches of astronomy, such as lunar studies, or the photography of the planets, or spectroscopy, or anything like that. Airy's driving concern right through his lifetime was the mathematics of planetary astronomy, because the mathematics of planetary astronomy lay at the heart of things like the Nautical Almanac, for which he knew he was paid out of the taxpayer's pocket. And in 1881, the year in which he retired, he made clear this very point, that all innovations in astronomy should be paid for by private individuals. The taxpayer should not be saddled by expenses which may not lead to anything of any direct practical application, such as, let's say, determining the chemical composition of the sun. Intellectually wonderful knowing the chemical composition of the sun, yes, but why should the British taxpayer pay for it? So therefore this is a very, very important thing which Airy himself brings and emphasises this amateur tradition. Now that's the tradition I want to talk about tonight, because it was also to a deeply sociable or clubbable passion, because many of these people knew each other, had similar societies, and by the late 1880s were starting to form the origins of places like the Orwell Society. Societies not of rich researchers, but of people with more modest incomes with serious interests in astronomy. The first real one to get off the ground being the Liverpool Astronomical Society in 1881. But first of all, let's have a look, what is amateur all about? And why do we have this amateur tradition in England and not in other countries? Well, this I would put down quite simply to the way in which we did business. In this country, we always had a government that was, on the whole, fairly low profile, that tended to keep, by constitutional principle, its nose out of private individuals' affairs. We had a monarchy which was profoundly admired, but nonetheless, from quite early stages, from the late 17th, early 18th century, was what we would call constitutional. No monarch has ever refused to sign a bill from Parliament that has passed through both houses since 1714. So therefore, the idea that Parliament rules England, and that Parliament is elected by what we just the people, a smaller percentage vastly more so than today, but nonetheless, what we had in this country is that more people could partake in public life than in any other country in Europe. If you were French, or German, or Spanish, or you lived in one of the Italian states, you had no say whatsoever in politics. If you were a merchant, a lawyer, a doctor, anybody like that. These were all highly autocratic political systems. Literally power down from the top, vertical lines of power. In England it was the opposite way around. People had money in their pockets. We had the richest, biggest middle class in Europe, and even England's poor in the 18th century staggered foreign visitors. Numerous French visitors were astonished to find the bigness and beefiness and powerful physique of English farm labourers. These men ate beef, unlike their scrawny French counterparts. They didn't eat gruel. And one key feature, always pointed out as a mark of an English peasant, he wore leather boots. He didn't wear clogs. He didn't wear wooden clogs, the hallmark of poverty in continental Europe. Now this tended to mean that what we developed in this country, therefore, was a buoyant working class. I'm not saying without for a moment without social problems, no, but a buoyant working class, a strong sense of national identity, a monarchy that was revered, but which, to put it plainly, knew its place in the broader constitutional order, a parliament which represented more or less the nation, because it even knew if you couldn't vote for it, it could burn your house down, it could smash your carriage windows, or it could allot a great campaign and deluge you with names telling you to do something. In fact, the abolition of slavery was a perfect case in point. Most of the people who howled out for the abolition of slavery were not the rich. They were ordinary people. But ordinary people who, although lacking votes, were still a tremendous power in the land, because it was recognised that they were free and they could break loose to marry hell if they wanted to. Very, very different from in France, where what they call generally the Jacquerie, Jacques, the French peasant, basically knew his place, until finally all hell broke loose in the revolution. Now this politics is crucial to British astronomy. You may think, what the heck has it to do with politics and astronomy? But what happens in Britain is that we become an initiative-taking society. If you want to get something done, a new road built, a new church built, a book published, or a piece of research to be conducted, you didn't go cap in hand to a minister of the crown. You simply either went to friends or stuck your hand into your own pocket. This is what I mean by amateur astronomy. Not amateur insofar that these people were just playing around, but that they were not doing it for money, and they were not expecting to be given money for it. The vast majority of people who undertook fundamental research in this country from the 17th to the early 20th centuries paid for it out of their own pocket. And this would go back even to figures like Jeremiah Horrocks in the early 17th century, the discoverer and the first observer of the transit of Venus of 1639. It would go right to the very end to people like Isaac Roberts, the great Liverpool master builder who built most of modern Liverpool, and actually was a very passionate advocate of astronomical photography and spectroscopy. So therefore, what is this tradition? And I think, like I say, British amateur astronomy comes out of an independent tradition. Now, what were the key areas in astronomy that were going on in the early part of the 19th century? Well, the most important thing, I think, and I hope I'm not being too politically prejudiced here or putting in too much of my own, what you would call, how I see society working, but Britain's enormous sense of destiny after the defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte. Bonaparte, we have to bear in mind, had invaded every country in Europe, with the exception of Sweden. He'd gone from Portugal to Scandinavia, from Spain to Russia, and he had put his own unique form of merciless ideological tyranny right across Europe. His ancestors are currently to be found in the European Union, but that's another story altogether. There was only one bit of Europe he never set foot on, and that was here, Great Britain. The nearest he ever got to it was Torbay. After Waterloo in 1815, he tried to flee. He was captured. He was put on the British battleship called HMS Bellerophon, nicknamed in the Royal Navy Billy Ruffian. And when the government decided what to do with him, he was brought, and HMS Bellerophon was anchored off what is now to become Torquay. And his ship was anchored there for several weeks, till it was decided to get rid of him by sending him to St. Helena. But as the Britain's sense of having defeated Bonaparte and liberated Europe, and helped to reorganise Europe after the Congress of Vienna of 1815, we actually felt a tremendous sense of national destiny. Because what had beaten Bonaparte had not just been military force and a naval force. It had been a buoyant economy, an industrial revolution, a burgeoning money market in London, and the domination of world trade. In other words, expressions of British commercial vibrancy had overturned Bonaparte. Now, these engines of power in society, the ability to make and use money, were to be turned into numerous activities in the coming decades. The buildings of great churches, like this one, art galleries, public parks, hospitals, scientific institutions, new colleges in Oxford and Cambridge, new universities in London, Durham, Manchester, Bristol, Birmingham, and all sorts of other places, every brass penny of which came out of the private purse. This is the tradition out of which British amateur astronomy comes. Now, the issues concerned with astronomy in the early part of the 19th century were not, of course, uniquely British. These were shared by astronomers in Germany, especially, or Russia, which was part of the German intellectual orbit, or France. We have to bear in mind, of course, English astronomers and their continental colleagues shared the same intellectual goals, the same intellectual standards, although they did not share the same political and financial institutions. And what we start to find is that the big thing that really lies at the heart in astronomy in, let's say, 1820 was planetary motion. How can you apply Newton's laws to the determination of the distance of the stars? Are Newton's laws truly universal, or do they just relate to the solar system? This led, therefore, by a number of people like Sir John Herschel, who I may say had his first job at 58 as the Master of the Royal Mint, not a bad first job, and also to Félix Savary, the great Frenchman, to the first determination of how to calculate stellar parallaxes in the 1830s. This certainly means, therefore, that the celestial geometry of the heavens is being pursued, yes, in Germany, by people like Otto Struve, but in this country, by people like Sir John Herschel, William Henry Smith, and others. On this side of the channel, you have people paying for it themselves. On the continent, people who are actually being paid by new universities for doing it. But universities funded often by highly autocratic governments, such as the Tsar of Russia, the various kings or republics of France, depending on whose head was on whose shoulders at any one time in the early part of the 19th century. Or, of course, the massively powerful King of Prussia, Wilhelm I, great-grandfather of Kaiser Bill of the First World War. Now, this means, therefore, over here, we have, if you wanted to measure stellar parallaxes, or involve yourself in the complex mathematics of binary stars, you pay for it yourself. There's another great question lurking as well. What William Herschel a few decades before had styled as the length, depth, breadth and profundity of the universe. How big was big? How infinite was infinite? Now, this kind of astronomy required a different type of optical resource for measuring planetary distances. The kind of telescopes devised for measuring parallaxes and observing the behaviour of binary stars were big, powerful refractors on clock drives with precision micrometers, capable of undertaking massively detailed mathematical processes. Edward Joshua Cooper of Markree in County Sligo, North West Ireland, or one of the finest of such telescopes in the world, came to be known, of course, as the Markree refractor. And he himself did fundamental parallax work. His assistant, Andrew Wilson, probably doing most of the donkey work. But then, of course, if you were trying to understand the length, breadth, depth and profundity of space, the best thing to do with were big mirror telescopes. Telescopes like the gigantic reflectors of Sir William and Sir John Herschel. But these were not the kind of telescopes you would ever have in a public observatory. They were awkward to build. They were very, very temperature sensitive, tricky to operate, and they were basically like dogs. They were one-man beasts. In the same way that you wouldn't swap dogs amongst a group of people, because the dog would acquire its own personal loyalty. So these giant telescopes were one-man telescopes. You had to get to know them and love them and work them and tweak them and know that on this particular kind of night with this particular particular kind of temperature, you'll have to tweak the rope slightly more than on another different kind of night. Now, when you're working in a professional observatory on a shift system, you need a technology which is immediately ready every time. But you can't crack the inner structure of the universe with anything other in the early 19th century than a large reflecting telescope. It's not for nothing that the Herschels, John Ramage in Scotland, William Lassell in Liverpool, Andrew Roberts in Liverpool, and many others, going for these giant telescopes. James Naismith, the great railway engineer, using the whole resources of his factory, which he uses to build railway locomotives in Manchester, to build his giant telescopes. And every bit of this in what would be called an amateur tradition. Men doing it because, as Sir John Herschel specified, men who do astronomy for love, in the Latinate sense of the word amant, as one to love. Now, let's have a look at some of the individuals involved in this process, because I think, like so many of these people, you find that there's a strong streak of good, rich English idiosyncrasy goes into this movement. Now, of course, you say that all of these men may have to be rich, yes. This telescope technology is very, very, very expensive. But what it means too, because of the nature of English society, many people who started out from very modest beginnings could become very wealthy in a totally different occupational context and semi-retire by 40, let's say, to devote the remainder of their lives to fundamental astronomy. Now, I want to start off by talking about two particular, rather curiously matched gentlemen. The first of these was Captain, later Admiral, William Henry Smith. Now, William Henry Smith is born in 1785, curious enough, exactly the same year that Thomas Clarkson wins his prize essay against the slave trade in Cambridge. He was actually of an American family. The Smiths were, in fact, going back to John Smith, the original American settler of the 17th century. But his dad was what was called an American loyalist, the kind of person that, on the whole, American history prefers to bleach out. His loyalty lay to George III, not to the revolutionary constitution. And he came back to England. And he married in England and produced his son, William Henry. William Henry is born into modest circumstances in London. His father left most of his property back in America. But of course, little William is fired with a wish for adventure. The Napoleonic Wars were just starting, or more correctly, the French Revolutionary Wars in the 1790s. He wants to go to sea. The idea of the English lad wanting to go to sea. He tells us that he climbed up the side of an East Indiaman moored in the docks in the Pool of London. He stowed away on board, didn't reveal himself till he was at sea. He so wanted to go to sea. Even run away from home without telling his parents where he'd gone. He found he loved ships. He eventually got into the Royal Navy as an ordinary able seaman. His brilliance was rapidly noticed. He was taken up and became master's mate. The master, of course, of a warship was the man responsible for the navigation, officer responsible for navigation. He rapidly was promoted into another ship, sailing master, the officer responsible for the safety of the ship. Later commissioned lieutenant, and then actually given the job of defending the Straits of Messina between Sicily and Italy. Here, of course, you find him in the guise of, I suppose you would sort of a kind of hornblower figure. He is snapping up French and other prizes. He's also snapping up ships from Morocco and slave ships from North Africa, of course the white slave ships operated by the Arab slave trade, and making quite a bit of money. And then comes the end of the war, and all the fun is over. Fortunately, he stays in commission in the Navy, because in the meantime he turned himself into an absolutely first-class navigator. He gets himself commissioned to start mapping the coasts of Turkey. And here he really finds his way. He becomes a hydrographer. He becomes an astronomer. And he's based in southern Italy, Naples, the very same place where, of course, Lord Nelson had been based 15 years before. And curiously enough, he falls in love with a woman in Naples. In the same way that Nelson had fallen in love, of course, with the British ambassador's wife, Lady Hamilton, leading to a rather steamy affair, which goodness knows where it would have been had not Nelson fallen in 1805. But in fact, the man with whom Smith fell in love was the governor's daughter. In fact, a rather charming lady called Annarella Warrington. It was blessed by the father, they married, and they became a Navy couple. And she remained having numerous children by him in Naples at the time when he was revisiting from his surveys of Turkey. He also, of course, fought with one of the men of his great mentor in Sicily. And this was Giuseppe Piazzi, the great Neapolitan astronomer, mathematician, and Roman Catholic priest. And in fact, when they had one of their sons, they named him after the great Italian astronomer, Charles Piazzi Smith, who of course would become himself a great power in the land of 19th century Scottish astronomy. And it's rather curious that these two very staunchly Protestant couple, Annarella and William, actually have a Roman Catholic priest as their son's godfather. But I think it's a marvellous connection. William Henry Smith, though, later retires from the Navy some years later. He goes to live in Bedford. And one of the things he does in Bedford is set up a spectacular, fine, private observatory. He starts to observe what later comes to be published as the Bedford Catalogue of Stars, using largely his prize money and perhaps money he'd inherited from the Warrington family. Now there, in Bedford, he meets a man very, very different from himself. This is Dr. John Lee. Now let me say who Dr. John Lee is. Dr. John Lee is a Cambridge graduate, a lawyer, the holder of a tremendously distinguished law practice in London, and the owner of 2 country estates in Northamptonshire, Bedfordshire. And he often used to travel to Bedford and beyond Bedford to attend the assizes. He often broke his journey in Bedford and found that there was this curious astronomer there. And the 2 men became great friends. And I'm often rather fascinated by the idea that here you have Dr. Lee, the lawyer, who may have spent his day on the judicial bench sending poachers to Australia, and then spent the evenings with his friend Smith round his house observing astronomical bodies. The 2 men formed a formidable scientific partnership, the Lee-Smith axis. Both of them utterly private gentlemen. And they were to run a tremendous series of what we would call astronomical weekends and so on at Hartwell House, which was, of course, Dr. Lee's great residence just outside Bedford. Now, in fact, this is a very characteristic early kind of amateur astronomical society. Because let's look at the temperaments of Lee and Smith. Smith, of course, was a jolly sailor. He was a man who had a tremendous sense of humour. He liked his drink. He liked his table. He was affable and very, very genial. And he also was to have a grandson who was to become famous in later life. And, in fact, his grandson was to become the first scout. Now, in fact, it's the first scout, Baden Powell, his daughter, Smith's daughter married Baden Powell, professor of logic at Oxford, and hence was the Baden-Powell connection. And the old first scout left in his memoirs a wonderful account of his granddad. That he said that when he was walking with Grandad, and Grandad by now is probably about 80, he always wore his coat completely buttoned up to the neck, strode out through the streets of Bedford, and always used to carry a pocketful of brand new pennies fresh from the bank, which he used to give to deserving children whom he met in the street. So therefore you have Smith, the big, affable, warm figure. Lee is very different. Lee is bachelor, a man who would describe as having a sort of a Roman sense of virtue, impeccably honest, very, very precise, deeply logical. Yet the 2 men hit it off like a house on fire. And there's no ever saying why 2 people hit it off together. These 2 utter opposites in so many ways, from the friendship that lasted for over 40 years without any significant break. And what they started to do was to invite friends to the great Hartwell House. Here you started to have the astronomical weekends. People would often go for several days, observing the great observatory in the grounds. If it was cloudy, then they would have various games in the house. These sound very, very jolly affairs. There's a wonderful account too by Peter Mark Roget, mathematician and perhaps better known as the writer of Roget's Thesaurus of the English Language, who described an experiment with a prism done in the great drawing room at Hartwell House, where having the sun coming in through a thin chink of light, he held the prism because there were two great sets of mirrors at opposite ends of the house, and by multiple reflections split the beam until you could see the Fraunhofer lines. And this was done for fun. Now, this, I think, is a form of early astronomical society. The people who came in were local clergy, scientific friends, friends from London, and foreign visitors. We know so much about the junketings at Hartwell Hall because the books of the place still survive. They're all preserved in the Museum of the History of Science in Oxford. Each time he had a weekend, people would be required to sign in, to say what they were interested in. And a joke, a comment, a quotation from scripture, a quotation from the classics, something to keep them all going. And there's one lovely little quotation from 1856, which actually is in Latin, of course, bearing in mind that these people were Latin literate. And it says, "Thank you, Miss Dr. Lee, for the wonderful conviviality of your house, which I greatly enjoyed," and a few other little things as well in Latin, signed Jacobus Whitbreadus Lee Glacier. James Whitbread Lee Glacier, later to become the great Cambridge mathematician. It was put underneath it, "Itart 8, aged 8. He's not only invited along with his parents, but he even puts a little Latin inscription in the journal book. Now this, of course, gives you what people say probably about children learning today, 8-year-olds writing Latin freely and easily in 1856. He was born in 1848, died in 1928. So this is one aspect of this wonderful astronomical culture. But by the 1810s and 20s, there were lots and lots of people in this country with a serious interest in astronomy. They were interested in a variety of things. Some would be the study of the surfaces of the planets. Some would be trying to measure the profundity of the universe. Some were experimenting to see if you could use prisms to determine what the sun might be made of, to try to see if you could make a connection between what you could get through the sunlight through a prism and what you could get through when you incandesce certain chemicals in the laboratory on the other. And of course some were interested in pure mathematics. And it was this which led to the founding of the first astronomical society in this country. It was founded on the 12th of January, 1820. It met at the Freemasons Tavern in London, which in those days was a very, very posh, upmarket restaurant in the city of London. They came together under the request of a Dr. Pearson, a clergyman schoolmaster. And it was a dinner in which about 18 men attended. Only one of them was a professional astronomer, and he was a foreigner visiting from Vilna in Russia, Peter Slavinsky. The rest of them were private English gentlemen. They decided they'd form a scientific dining club given over to astronomy to meet on the second Friday of every month. They met together on the 12th of February, 1820. But then they did one very, very simple thing. Each man was given a glass of port. He drank it and recited the king's health. The king had just died, George III, and they toasted the new sovereign come to the throne, George IV. But in recognition of the old king's death, they had no dinner and transacted no business. And then, having drank the toast of the new monarch, went home. But they then met by same agreement the next month, and the next month, and the next month, and the next month. That dining club became the Royal Astronomical Society. And of course that is the first very eminently clubbable scientific society. Men coming together, not only of course to do science together as a meeting, but often to dine together as well. What is more, their journal books and their registers survive in a completely, absolutely tip-top condition. It's possible to see who attended on literally every second Friday in the last 180 years. Who sat with whom, and in many ways you could see who liked and who didn't like who. And it was from this body, like I say, in 1830, 10 years later, that a charter was requested from the King to become the Royal Astronomical Society. British astronomy, therefore, is rooted in the amateur tradition, the initiative-taking tradition, and intimately bound up with food, drink, and good fellowship. Very, very different indeed from the more rigid academic structures found in continental Europe. Now, this tradition runs very, very richly. But what about the Royal Society itself? We're talking here of the RAS. What about the Royal Society? Well, it was exactly the same. If you were going to be a member or a fellow of the Royal Society in the early part of the 19th century, or in 1660 when it had been founded, you came in exactly the same attitude. You came as fellowship, good companionship, exchange of ideas, and usually following the meeting either in the coffee house or in an eating house. You think of this. You think of all the English learned societies. They all have fellowships. Fellow of the RAS, Fellow of the Royal Society, Fellow of the College of Antiquaries, Meteorological Society, Geological, the rest of them, they all have fellows. Why don't we have academicians? The academician was a very essentially European feature. What tended to happen in France, the Italian states, in Berlin, in St. Petersburg, in Copenhagen, the monarch would choose to patronize a subject. A minister of state would become its focusing agent. And then state funding would be used to give nice little handouts, cash grants and titles to right people in that society. In other words, once again, it was a vertical line of descent. In England, you have self-electing bodies. You are fellows, not academicians. You are dining chums. You are not tipping your forelock to some minister of state. The pattern is based very, very much on the basis of the Oxford and Cambridge colleges. You think of the structures of all the Oxford and Cambridge colleges. They have a warden and fellows, a master and fellows, a president and fellows. Who elects the president, the master, the warden, or whatever? The fellows themselves, usually from amongst each other. It's this deep democratic tradition, self-electing, self-funding tradition in English institutions, which is present in Oxford and Cambridge even to this day, in spite of what is currently going on in London, and hopefully it will sustain for a long time. This lies at the heart of not just British astronomy, but British chemistry, British medicine, British geology. You think of something, let's say, like the Royal College of Surgeons. It's not a Royal Academy of Surgeons, it's a fellowship of surgeons. Why do you become an FRCS? You elect to it. You choose your own members and you set your own standards. A very, very good friend of mine in Oxford 2 years ago, Andrew Farmery, a consultant surgeon, was saying to me that you're having to do his stint as an examiner, electing new fellows to the college. The tradition still continues, although sadly, as Farmery has told me, the government is trying to poke its nose increasingly into who is elected, therefore turning the medical profession into a politicised organisation. But that's another story. This now is the origin of where our science and our astronomy comes from. But what too about some of the extraordinary pieces of ingenuity and initiative? Well, we find a number of spectacular pieces of hardware being built out of private money. None of them more spectacular than Lord Ross's giant telescope at Birr Castle in Ireland, completed in 1845. Now, what did Lord Ross build that monster for? 72-inch mirror, 52 feet focal length, between two gigantic stone walls, controlled by powerful hand-operated machinery. It was there for one purpose, and more or less it had served that purpose within its first few weeks of coming into use. Were the nebulae objects containing structure? Were they just blobs, or did they contain structure? Because if they contained structure, it was argued by astronomers, it would suggest that forces of gravity were acting inside them. And when in fact M51, the whirlpool, was first seen and properly identified in 1845, the very idea that you have a whirlpool suggests something rotating in space, something rotating around the centre, with very, very powerful gravitational arms. Within a few weeks, Lord Rosse had discovered a dozen separate objects that showed structure. Some of them were face-on, like the whirlpool. Some of them seemed to be sideways, on a sort of tailings coming up, suggesting that instead of rotating like that to our plane of view, some of them were rotating like that. The universe was suddenly shown to be a spectacularly strange place. But nonetheless, what was active in it were the same forces of gravity that were in the solar system. Nobody knew how far away these nebulae were. Were they in the solar system? Were they part of our own galaxy? Or were they what Lord Rosse even speculated they might be? Island universes, something completely beyond our own star system. Not until the early 20th century, with Edwin Hubble in America, in the 1920s, would it become possible to actually say yea or nay where they were. But you can get the idea of the kind of immense intellectual passion driving these men. Now, the great telescope at Birk Castle, I have discovered, and I think I did discover this, because I've never seen it anywhere else, know how much it cost to build. £12,000. That was also including the fact that most of it was built by Lord Rosse's appointees and artisans. Had it been commissioned from a firm in London or Manchester, goodness knows what it would have cost. Who paid for it? Because Lord Rosse wasn't especially rich. In fact, although he owned estates in Central Ireland, a lot of it was bog, and hence, of course, which is true, they produced peat for fires, but on the other hand, it was not tremendously lucrative as agricultural land. Well, it so happened, his wife was a Yorkshire lass. Mary, 3rd Countess of Rosse, came from not very far out of Halifax. She was one of 2 sisters. Their father was what was called a Yorkshire grazier. He actually owned goodness knows how many hundreds of acres of prime Yorkshire moorland on which sheep grazed. And the wool, of course, was sold into the woolen industry. She and her sister, being the sole heirs of their dad, each ended up as very, very attractive heiresses indeed. One of them becomes Lord Rosse's Countess. It's Mary's money that largely pays for the Leviathan of Parsonstown, as they called it in the 19th century. But of course, too, Lady Rosse was herself seriously interested in science. She shared her husband's passion for astronomy. She was herself an accomplished photographer and actually received the gold medal of the Astronomical Society, of the Photographic Society of Ireland. She was fascinated by even trying to take photographs through that giant telescope, although, of course, the slowness of the plates and the lack of any equatorial mechanism on the telescope meant that actually such photographs were not possible. But that great, great enterprise of 19th century astronomy, the biggest telescope in the world until 1905, actually was entirely the product of a private individual. Now, also too, what about James Naismith, the great Manchester railway engine builder? James Naismith was the son of a Scottish artist. He'd actually gone into the Industrial Revolution in a big way. He had, of course, invented that immensely lucrative device, the steam hammer, that would become crucial for the forging of large iron castings in Victorian industry. He opened a firm at Patrickcroft with an original loan of £500. Patrickcroft is very close to where I come from in Lancashire, 4 miles north of Manchester. And here he made a fortune building railway locomotives in the 1830s, 40s and 50s. He also was fascinated by astronomy. He tells us that his father back in Scotland had been a great friend of the great Scottish physicist Sir David Brewster, in what is often broadly called the Athens of the North in the early 19th century. His dad had owned a 4-inch refracting telescope, and he says he never forgets as a boy having David Brewster explaining things in the sky through his dad's 4-inch telescope. Now, not many lads get the foremost physicists of the age to give them astronomy lessons when they're 10. But this certainly bore fruit with Naismith's case. He developed machinery for steam-driving, massively accurate metal mirrors. And he forms a tremendous friendship with a Liverpool called William Lassell. William Lassell had made his mint, basically speaking, selling beer to Irish workers and sailors in Liverpool. Let's put it basically, if you owned a brewery in Liverpool in 1830, you could not anything other than make money. Becoming rich was an occupational hazard, quite simply. You couldn't avoid it. And he makes a lot of money. I've even found out too that at one stage he was the official supplier of beer to the Liverpool Dock Board. Quite simply, of course, the men were working 12-hour days on the docks. You didn't let them off at dinner time, they wouldn't come back, they'd go to the pubs and get plastered. It was permitted instead, therefore, to have beer shops on the docks, where they got plastered on the docks. And it was Lassell who supplied them with the beer. Lassell was a planetary astronomer. From his teens, he'd been captivated by planetary astronomy, and especially the planet Saturn. And he himself discovered the inner crate ring in Saturn, and along with a number of other features on Saturn. He also, too, when Neptune was discovered in 1846, discovered its satellite Triton. And we have to bear in mind here, had things been slightly different in 1846, Neptune would not have been discovered at the University of Berlin Observatory. It would have been discovered in the back garden of a wealthy Liverpool brewer. For some reason or other, when John Couch Adams had produced his calculations about the position of his unknown planet, he communicated it to a number of people in Cambridge and to Airy. But Airy happened to be in continental Europe at the time. Surprisingly enough, it never got through the astronomical network, just simply at the right ascension and declination possible position for this object. The planet was discovered in Berlin on the 23rd of September, 1846. Things travelled pretty quick in those days, and about a few days later, it appeared in the Times. William Lassell tells us that he read it over breakfast one morning, and this was something like the 28th of September. The next night was cloudy. The next night was clear. And he gets out his giant 24-inch equatorially mounted telescope in a great observatory in the grounds of his house, one of the biggest steerable reflectors in the world. Not the biggest mirror, but the biggest equatorial in the world. He not only found Neptune like that, he described it as shining so big and bright and round that it looked like a half-crown shining in the telescope. So instead of having to grope through little dots and moving things like the Germans had been doing, he gets it bang and it's like a half-crown. And then he suddenly realises there's a little star next to it. The next night the little star has moved. The first observation of the planet, he discovers its satellite. Quite literally, Triton is discovered by a Liverpool brewer. But of course, who is Lassell? He's a leading fellow of the RAS. He's also a distinguished fellow of the Royal Society as well. There is, by the mid-1840s, an excellent railway system burgeoning across this country. You could be in London in 6 hours from leaving Liverpool. In fact, slightly quicker than you can do it today on Richard Branson's Virgin train. That's another story. It was quite easy to pop down from Liverpool, attend scientific meetings in London, attend the RAS, attend the Royal Society, dine at the Crown and Anchor, or at the Athenaeum, or somewhere like that, and go back to the north again. You've got to bear in mind that one of the things which holds this clubbable passion of amateur astronomy together was the railway system. It was so easy to get about Britain, if, of course, you could afford it. That was a very, very important thing. But then, what about the more democratization of astronomy, as it were? What about people who were not brewers, machine engineers, aristocrats? What about them? Well, surprisingly, astronomy sank through the Victorian social fabric with an astonishing speed. You have people interested in astronomy on every social level. I found the case, for instance, of a man called John Leach of Frodsham in Cheshire. He made shoes. He wanted a better telescope. Don't all astronomers want a better telescope? He was earning about 15 shillings a week as a shoemaker in Frodsham. And what does he do? He writes to William Ewart Gladstone, the Prime Minister. Gladstone's permanent private secretary passes the letter on to Sir George Airy, the Astronomer Royal, and amazingly, a correspondence starts up between the Astronomer Royal and the Cheshire shoemaker. He gets given a telescope worth about £5. Airy even says as well that I selected myself the pair of globes for him, a globe of the earth and a globe of the heavens. Crucial, of course, for understanding geometrical astronomy in those days was relating things on the earth to things in the heavens. Then also, too, there was Roger Langdon. Roger Langdon was a working railway porter on the Great Western Railway. He finally became station master of the little Devon village of Silverton, 6 miles on the London side of Exeter. There he had no assistant. He was station master, ticket collector, and general factotum. He had a house on the site. His wife taught the local village school, herself an astonishingly educated railway porter. And the more I have looked at this provision, the more and more people in what the Victorians rather patronisingly called humble life were seriously interested in astronomy. But what about those who fell between the grand amateurs and the working man amateurs? Because it was out of these that societies like this came to be born. In the autumn of 1880, a series of lectures were put on in Liverpool. These lectures were on popular astronomy. They generated so much interest, it was felt by the attendees that they should form from them a society. This would not, though, be the first society to be founded, but the first one that would actually survive. The first one had been founded back in 1859 in Leeds. The journal books still survive amongst the precious possessions of the Leeds Astronomical Society. But the Leeds Society, after an initial flourish and a corrugated iron, what was called telescope house, to keep their 3-inch refractor in, chosen for them by none other than Sir John of Urshan, the society went into abeyance. What you begin to find by the 1850s onwards is that in England there are a lot of people in more modest middle-class circumstances, teachers, local doctors, country solicitors, and so on. Not rich, but far from poor, who are seriously interested in astronomy, and perhaps can afford to spend 10, 15, 20 guineas. The publication of the Reverend Thomas William Webb's book on common celestial objects for common telescopes, 1859, itself became a sort of beginning post of modern amateur astronomy. The first book ever written for the ordinary amateur who could afford what was called a common telescope. Telescope, in other words, what he defines as a 3 or a 4-inch refractor. Pretty ambitious for most people, but nonetheless it defines the market. The educated, modest, middle-class person with 20 guineas spare. But by the 1880s, this movement has grown from a sort of rumbling start to something that sustains. Before very long, the Liverpool Astronomical Society has over 100 members. The kind of people they start to attract are people who don't want to join the RAS. They find that the papers of the RAS are perhaps too mathematical, too abstruse. They want to come together to observe the heavens, swap results, have lantern slide shows, the kind of pattern we see in the modern astronomical society. What is astonishing too is that the Liverpool Astronomical Society becomes, I think, the first scientific society in this country to be equally open to women as well as to men. Very, very early on, there are women members. Right from the word go, in fact, from the early lists, about 8 women members. Many of the early astronomical societies would have in the region of 10 or 11% female membership after about 1881. Now this takes off with a vengeance. The Liverpool Society becomes international. It becomes a sort of British Empire society for the English-speaking world. There are Australian members, Isle of Man members, and an astonishing branch at Pernambuco in South America. Pernambuco and the Liverpool Astronomical Society. Well, Pernambuco, of course, was rich mining area. A large number of English engineers lived in Pernambuco with their wives and families. There was a big British expat community in Pernambuco. And they formed a chapter of the Liverpool Astronomical Society in Pernambuco. We know this because they reported their proceedings back to Liverpool, and their documents still survive. They elected a chairman and a secretary and all the apparatus of an amateur society. And then it catches on like wildfire. 1891, 2 societies leap into being. One of these in Leeds, the revived Defunct Society of 1859, and the other one in Cardiff. The Cardiff Society was not just astronomy, it was called the Cambrian Natural History Society, the Welsh Scientific Society, you might call it. But one of its biggest and most connected branches was its astronomy department. They met regularly in Cardiff. Now we also know a number of figures in these societies that you can trace, because they wonderfully too published their membership lists. Now Manchester Astronomical Society came slightly later, and being myself a native of Manchester, when I went through their original membership lists, I could tell right away that most of their members came from the posher parts of Manchester, places like Didsbury, and places like that where the more comfortably off ones lived. North Manchester, the cotton and coal belt, no members. But then, what about the BAA? The Liverpool Astronomical Society developed a number of branches around the country, and a number of its offices were not just in the Liverpool area. One of these offices was Miss Elizabeth Brown of Cirencester, an active solar observer. And as the late 1880s grew on, she felt that somehow or other, and not of course being a Liverpoolian herself, that the National Society, or the British Imperial Society, should actually be bigger than any one English town. And she suggested that there should be a National Society based in London. Now there was, of course, holding all of these amateur societies together, one remarkably best-selling literary organ, the magazine The English Mechanic. The English Mechanic had articles on anything technical. How to make a cannon, how to make a church organ, how to melt iron in your kitchen, how to make explosives, how to make telescopes. And a Captain Noble, an ex-military officer, did a regular piece on the sky at night. What was in the heavens at the moment? The English Mechanic became the organ of all kinds of people interested in technological innovation. And one of the reasons why we know so much about the basic personnel of the people of the amateur astronomy community of this time is because they often sent letters to the English Mechanic, and if they were sufficiently prominent, often got obituaries when they died. Now, in this way, you can put together a sort of geography of English astronomy by 1890. And in September 1890, the first grounds were got going to have a meeting in London. The meeting took place some days later at Barnard's Inn Hall, just off Holborn, in the legal district of London. Barnard's Inn was one of the legal societies, like the Middle Temple or Lincoln's Inn. And here, largely under the aegis of Miss Elizabeth Brown, the BAA, the British Astronomical Society, was founded. And of course, it grew, and grew greatly. It is, of course, you don't need me to tell you, still with us and very active today. Now, this means that by the early part of the 20th century, in this country, amateur astronomy was booming with an extraordinary zeal. But so much about it still was paid for by the individual. Because in addition to the people who, like ourselves, let's say, who are doing astronomy out of love on a modest income, you still had those who were doing big, serious, research-based astronomy and paying for it themselves into the nature of spectroscopy, galactic or extragalactic nebulae, star fields, spectroscopy, planetary dynamics, and that eternally, abidingly interesting subject, the geology of the moon. Does the moon have change? Is the moon unchanging? These questions were being asked in the 1850s and 60s in the same way that they're being asked today. I think the astronomical tradition developed in this country and the amateur one, the loving of astronomy tradition, became, like a lot of other of our national institutions, a model to be followed elsewhere. The founding of things like the Astronomical Society of the Pacific in America in the period, in the decades after the American Civil War, was itself based upon the English custom. Because in many ways, the country which was closest to England in spirit in these forms of organisation was the United States. The United States had always had, obviously, a big, up-with-your-bootstraps approach to life, and where, of course, people had paid for things themselves. But where American professional astronomy was different was simply the massive colonisation of the continent after the Civil War. Because as the settlements settled right across America from the Appalachians to the west, from the more or less the 1840s onwards, but especially after the building of the railroad in 1867, it now meant that the Central American government bought and paid for land for universities, research stations, and often paid professionals to run them. So America therefore grew up in a sort of bicameral system, where on the one hand you had genuine government patronage of science in research institutes across the continent, but on the other hand too, a tremendous high level of independent spending. Perhaps the most spectacular of these was the great telescope in Cincinnati, completed in 1846, a giant instrument with a 15-inch lens, built for the citizens of Cincinnati, which, although it did serious astronomical research in the Great Plains, started that extraordinary custom of having what we would now call open nights to the public. So the ordinary citizens of Cincinnati could go along and see through their giant telescope, paid for out of private local subscription. The story, therefore, of British astronomy is a great one. I suppose in some ways one could round it up with somebody like Sir Patrick Moore. And of course, I've been very interested in at this time, with the 50th anniversary of The Sky at Night, in looking at Sir Patrick's, as it were, cultural and intellectual lineage. And I place him very, very much foursquare in that tradition. And if in fact Sir Patrick is often commented on or spoken of because of his, what you might call his rather larger-than-life nature, his idiosyncrasies and various other features, you have to bear in mind too that they are bang in line with that tradition. You have to realise that virtually everybody in this English tradition very often have finely honed peculiarities. And I think this is one of the central things which makes it a uniquely English tradition. It's a tradition I want to see survive. I don't want to see it wiped out by centralisation, by institutions that have no rights there, poking their noses in, and creating a society which is rather more controlled than I think is good for civil liberties. But you have to bear in mind, astronomy does not exist in an intellectual vacuum. It's part of the wider values and context of how you see your society. And the enormous innovation that we produced in astronomy in the 19th century is intimately bound up with our libertarian tradition and our great prosperity. Can I now have my slides, please? English grand amateurs. This is Stephen Groombridge. Now, I admit that he doesn't look very happy. Why, I have no idea, but in fact, Groombridge was a very wealthy stockbroker. He left business in the first decade of the 19th century, at about the time of the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, and retired to Greenwich. And he established a private observatory in Greenwich, which was better than that of the Royal Observatory. And he observed what came to be called the Groombridge Catalogue. Literally, you have a better observatory than Greenwich, working within half a mile as the crow flies from where the astronomer Royal lived. And some of you may have seen in various histories Groombridge's star. His discovery of a star with a very, very large proper motion, suggesting that that star might go closer to us than other stars with bigger proper motions. Could I have the next one, please? Sorry. This is the privately funded instrument, the 4-foot instrument, by a man called Edward Troughton. 4 feet in diameter, the most accurate angle measuring instrument in the world at the time. There was no instrument anywhere that could take right ascension and declination angles and measure the positions of astronomical bodies more accurately than that, and that is 1806. Next one, please. And this is a photograph, obviously a modern photograph, of his house. Indeed, it was here at number 6 Elliot Place in Greenwich, where the man lived. That was the front door of his house, and you notice the window to the left. Well, that window is what is now survived of the blocked-off great slit. That was the transit room, where the instrument I just showed you was in the side of the shed. And it was next door to his dining room. And he always kept an astronomical clock. This is Groombridge, always kept an astronomical clock in his dining room. And even if he had guests to dinner, and he noticed that a star was coming to the meridian in a few minutes, he would beg to be excused, go to the room next door, open the shutters, take the transit, and then come back and resume the meal. Next one, please. Now, this is a rather spectacular private observatory, the Observatory of Mr. Bishop in Regent's Park. This was literally a great private institution in Regent's Park and became the training ground for many later Victorian astronomers. And what was Mr. Bishop? He was a wine merchant. Next one, please. Now, this is the observatory of quite a spectacular figure. And notice all the rubbish in the foreground. This indeed was the observatory of Sir James South. Now, Sir James South married money and did very well. He was a surgeon at St. Thomas's Hospital in the late 1810s. He married a lady who came with an enormous price tag around her neck. Her father owned the biggest brewery in Lambeth. He gave up medicine and surgery, resigned all of his hospital appointments, and built a large private observatory. This was the observatory of what was called Blackman Street in London. Unfortunately, he seems to have become highly litigious, and he fell out with Edward Troughton, the instrument maker, and in a fit of pique smashed up his observatory. Next one, please. And then raffled it all off. The observatory at Camden Hill, to shycock makers, toy makers, smoke jack makers, mock coin dealers, and also fellows of the Royal Astronomical Society. Now, when you read that in detail, you do wonder that this man was probably a little bit scatty. And one wonders too, had he not himself been a medic and a knight, he could perhaps have entered Bedlam on his own rights. But of course, astronomers could do very strange things as well, and Sir James South is one of the spectacular figures of early Victorian astronomy. Next one, please. Now, this is Edward Joshua Cooper, the owner of the great Irish Observatory at Markree in County Sligo. Next one, please. And this is his giant telescope. Notice at the very bottom left-hand corner the figure of a man. That gives you an idea of what a whopper this was. This had a 15-inch object glass made in Paris and built, in fact, by Grubb of Dublin. Got to bear in mind, Howard Grubb doesn't start as a telescope maker. It's his relationship, in fact, with Mark Green and with Cooper that turns into telescope making. The Grubb firm first came into his business in Dublin was manufacturing something equally novel in the entertainment industry. Iron bed billiard tables. Instead of expensive Welsh slate, rolled iron billiard tables. And because he was also a fine engineer, Cooper happened to ask him to remount this giant object glass, which of course began the Grubb optical industry in the early 1830s. Next one, please. This is Dr. Lee, the famous friend of Admiral Smith. I think one can't deny that he looks a fairly severe gentleman. He was not a humorous person, but nonetheless seems to have been excellent social company. Next one, please. And this is his great friend, Admiral Smith, the former, well, I suppose, hornblower figure in the Straits of Messina, and of course, the father of Charles Piazzi Smith, and of course, the grandfather of the first Scout. Next one, please. And this is Dr. Lee at one of the telescopes in his observatory, the Great Transit Telescope. Now, also to bring over the sort of the clubbable nature of the Hartwell gatherings, all the regular members had special skull caps made with different designs from the heavens embroidered on them. And here, of course, you can see Dr. Lee's cap, which actually has the zodiacal constellations embroidered around the front with a great gold tassel at the back. Next one, please. And this is the interior of the observatory. Now, that telescope still survives. It's in the store of the Science Museum at London. Not on the view, sadly, but in the store. But it's still there, and it's still working. Next one, please. Now, this, of course, is your very own George Tomlin. Again, of course, the idea of a gentleman setting up a private observatory, the Tomlin Refractor at Orwell Park. This is Tomlin himself. Next one, please. And I'm afraid, for some reason, I didn't realise that I've actually broken the glass on this slide. But why I put this one in, this is the catalogue, the Red Hill catalogue from Red Hill in Kent, of Richard Christopher Carrington. And why I put this on, it shows on the frontispiece of his catalogue, you see his observatory, his house, with his observatory, but notice that the railway passes directly in front because you can see the signal gantry. Yes, please. Now, one man I haven't been able to say again much about tonight, but he was a great friend of William Massell, the great, great observer, William Rutter Dawes. Himself a medical man who abandoned the medical profession to devote most of his life to astronomy. Next one, please. And his great friend, William Lassell, this is one of the numerous superb drawings that Lassell did of Saturn, and this is printed in the Proceedings of the Royal Astronomical Society. This is 1853. Next one, please. Now, this is Isaac Roberts, a Welshman who made his fortune in Liverpool, building most of the centre of Victorian Liverpool. He became a passionate astronomer. He owned a large house at Maghull to the north of Liverpool, and later, because that part of the world became too smoky, retired to Crowborough in Kent, where he was to devote the remaining 30 years of his life to what is really, in every sense of the word, pure professional astronomy, but entirely paid for by himself, out of his own pocket. Next one, please. And this is Silverton Station in Devon, 6 miles out of Exeter, on the line to London. This is where Roger Langdon lived for 20 years. Notice he has a little observatory next to the house, next to the flagpole of the house. You see the railway platform, the station master's house, and some corrugated iron buildings. This is where, on 30 shillings a week, and with a free house, he did serious astronomical research. Next one, please. And that's the house as it is today. Because some years ago, I was in Devon, and the people I was staying with, I don't drive unfortunately, was able to run me round, and we were able to find that very house. The station, of course, is now gone. Beeching got rid of that in the 1950s, so there's no sign of any station now. What the heck, well, this house still survives, and of course is now just a private residence, but this would have been the station master's house. Next one, please. And could I have the lights up, please? So here, ladies and gentlemen, I hope I've given you a admittedly rapid tour tonight through the British astronomical tradition, through the extraordinary clubbable passion of amateur astronomy. But I would like to finish by just one little thing. What I've said about astronomy could be repeated time and time again for other burgeoning intellectual disciplines in England. Archaeology, antiquarian studies, numismatics, the study of geology, and so on and so on. The British intellectual community paid its own way. And I was having a conversation only earlier on this week in Oxford with a friend of mine, a man called Richard Sharp, who's Professor of Paleography, which is the study of ancient medieval handwriting. And he was mentioning the first conference that was held in 1886, the first scholarly study of the Domesday Book. The Domesday Book, of course, was published by William the Conqueror, came out in 1086. 1886, there was a scholarly study of that document. Sharp told me that none of the academics from the universities attended it. There weren't very many. And all the people who were at that time concerned with medieval documents, medieval scripts, language, archaeology, and everything pertaining to the journals of what later would become, of course, the British Antiquarian Society, were all private gentlemen. Clergymen, lawyers, exactly the same breed as the amateur astronomers. This was a standard universal pattern going right through British society. So we have to bear in mind what we've said tonight about astronomy. You could apply to at least 8 or 10 other serious intellectual disciplines as well, from astronomy on the one hand to the digging up of flint axe arrowheads in Salisbury Plain on the other. Thank you.
You're walking up there, Peter, like one of these American brides. It's Kate with the club logo, obviously. We'd like also Roy Adams to come up. Roy predates just about everybody in this society. Certainly our longest serving member. And
thank you.
The trustee of the society. Would you, Alan and Roy, care to...
Is there a knife?
Do we have enough?
Thank you. No.
There's only the one knife, though.
Yeah, shall we try that
So
way?
we'll try this way. And,
So which way shall we try? I suppose put it straight, shall we?
Right. Very nice. Right.
Right.
Lovely tree.
Lovely.
There.
Shall we do it that way as well?
Yes. We've got to feed 5,000 with it.
I suppose we should do it in straight slices.
Without touching the floor of the 40 there.
Ah, yes.
There we are. A little pushing.
There we are. Wonderful.
Thank you, gentlemen. We won't ask you to sing Happy Birthday. Which
You are wrong.
to have a cup of tea, have a piece of cake, and Alan will be available to answer any questions. Should you come up with one between now and whenever? Tea is served.
there. Oh, you could have watched Derek.